What is a person's most powerful sex organ? Most powerful sex. Here, let me do something here. I want to put this up here. Right here. Whoa. I could get X-rated for this. I could be turned off all TVs in the world. This is your most powerful sex organ. His and hers. You ready? It's not covered by a swimming suit. It's not between your legs, it's between your ears. The most powerful sex organ that you have. His and hers. Right here is where sex is determined. You say, yeah, okay. In a few minutes, you're going to really see what I mean by that. The most powerful sex organ you have is your mind. Do you realize your mind weighs about 3 pounds? It's the most intricate, complicated 3 pounds of mass in the entire universe. You say, oh yeah, that's nice. No, it's true. Let me show you what I mean. In this 3 pound of mass in your brain, there's 10 billion neurons. Whoa. There's 100 billion support cells. Get this. There's 100 trillion. You couldn't count to trillion probably in 3 months. There's 100 trillion connectors that connects all the neurons and the cells together for you to operate. Now here's to me what's really amazing. Every second, 1 million new connectors are created in your brain. We just went through 2.5 million. No, I'm serious. Think of that. That's why it's the most intricate mass, 3 pound mass in the universe, the human brain. And this is what's amazing. Remember the connectors? These connect the cells together. And I want to show you this. The connectors are like this. They connect the cells, and through this passes in like an electrical shock, like in a cord, you plug it in, and the electricity goes through the cord. And it goes from one cell to the other cell to help you make decisions and all in rapid succession. But here's the problem. If you take an electrical cord and you strip all the coating off of it, then it'll water down how fast and how much of the current goes to the end of the cord. Well, it's the same way here. When you are born, you're born with just a bare connector, and they're created with bare connectors. But as you grow older, there's a white kind of, what would you call it, insulation called myelin that forms around your cell starting the end of your teenage years going into your 20s. And it starts to insulate it like this. And it forms, it's often called the myelin shaft. It forms a whitey matter around it so your electrical signals from one cell to the other and decision making and everything will pass through it without being watered down and fast. But this doesn't happen in your mind until the end of your teenage years and the beginning of 20 to 25 years of age. Now, this is key to understand. The key to sex is not between your legs. It's between your ears. You probably all know what orgasm is, or you heard about it and everything. Well, it's quite an exciting feeling. Orgasm happens right here. Does not happen between your legs. And it's now proven scientifically it happens in your mind. You guys don't believe me? You don't think that's true in Haiti? Let me tell you. Disconnect your mind, guys, and try to get aroused. You can't. It's right up here. Now remember this. They have never created a condom for the mind. You with me? They've never created a condom for the mind. Now, the Bible says flee sexual immorality, for it's the one sin that affects your body, starting with your mind. Can sex affect or change your brain? Yeah. Is that ever proven scientifically now? 25 years ago, they wouldn't have known. Today, yes. With the new CAT scans, PETs and fMRIs and all, they can watch your brain operate. And it can actually, the choices you make, and you'll see this as we go on, the choices you make literally, physically affect your brain. Now remember this, God says avoid sexual, this was back when nobody knew any of this 2,000 years ago. For it's the one sin you commit against your body, starting with your brain. All right. Is there a love hormone? Yeah, there is. It's called oxytocin. You ever heard of it? You ought to. It's a major part of who you are, especially sexually. Oxytocin is often known as the cuddle hormone. That's kind of a pretty saying. It's a bonding hormone, and it's a chemical that your brain releases during sex and activity leading up to it. And what it does, this chemical, when it's released, produces caring, trust, and deep affection, especially on the part of the woman for the man, no matter who the man is. When oxytocin is released, which starts with people used to call it petting, that's what you do at a petting zoo. But when you start physically caressing someone, this oxytocin will start to be released. And when it does, then that chemical starts to create a bond, an attachment to that other person, physically starting in the brain. That's why it's often called the bonding chemical. And recently on the TV movie House, it's about the medical doctor, and he wanted to continue this sexual relationship with this woman. So he took in a cup of coffee, knew she had a cup there. He sat down his, and when he left, he picked up hers and walked out. One of the other doctors saw him walk down and said, "House, what are you trying to do? What'd you put in there?" And he said, this just the other night, he said, "Oxytocin." No, see? Why? Because it's the love hormone, the cuddle. And the more he had a relationship with her, the more she would be attached to him physically, chemically, in the brain.
Oxytocin is released in the female brain whenever there's touching and hugging, bonding you to the person you're touching and hugging with, making you trust them more and giving a deeper level of bonding to that person. Vasopressin does the same thing in the male brain, which leads to a progression of the touching and hugging, and intercourse ensues. With intercourse, there is reproduction, which then bonds you to the children that are produced as a result. Is there a problem if I only have sex with my boyfriend? If you only have sex with your boyfriend, you must understand sex doesn't make a relationship, and you don't have to have sex to be in a relationship. You also need to understand that the younger you are when you have sex, the less likely that relationship is to be permanent, and therefore you will change boyfriends more than once. And the more people you have relationships with, the more you are exposing yourself to the possibility of sexually transmitted diseases, to pregnancy, and even to difficulty forming healthy relationships in the future.
It's what produces a close, loving relationship. And as the relationship progresses, there's more oxytocin released, and it literally strengthens the relationship. And what they have found, that a couple who's been married a good number of years, the oxytocin is released is so much more than any kind of relationship a single person has. Because it takes a while to build that up into that really binding, connecting relationship physically, chemically. Remember when I said one of the reasons God created sex was a unity factor? Part of that is built right into our minds. To take that spiritual emotion and make it into one, in attachment and bonding to another person. Can sex keep a bad relationship going? I've taught this for years. And I've always said yes, but never could prove it scientifically. Now you can. Sex can literally, especially on the part of you girls, can keep a bad relationship going. Why? When oxytocin is released, no matter who the man is, you start to honestly evaluate a person in a super wonderful way. That's why often oxytocin is referred to as producing, these are rose glasses, producing the pink lens effect. Because when oxytocin is released in a young lady, she'll start to fantasize about the person. And it's almost like putting on pink lenses and everything looks rosy and pink. And it can even be a very harmful relationship. Have you ever heard, I mean, you probably even know some women in a relationship, they're physically abused and everything, but they stay in there. Why? Because the chemical oxytocin that is released into their body. And it causes them to distort, they call it scientifically, warp judgment. This is why I say, young ladies, this is why I was so concerned about my relationship with my daughters. You must listen to your parents. Listen to your friends. Because often you'll be in a relationship, you will not see it physically. You won't see it. But your friends will. Your parents will. And I would always say this. If you're in a relationship and you want to go further with it, but your friends don't think it's good and your parents, I would say absolutely back off. You've got the pink lens effect. You're warping your judgment of who that person really is on there. And this happens physically in our brain. You say, well, wait a minute. Well, wait, this comes back to, well, if it feels good, do it. Ooh, can that be dangerous? Because it can feel good with anyone. Let me ask you this question. Can memory affect your sex life? Can your sex life affect your memory? In a big way. And it's all starting right in your brain. Have you ever wondered, now think of this, why certain things you remember and certain things you don't? You probably never thought of this. For example, let's say, what's your first name?
Michelle.
Michelle. Let's say 5 years ago, a guy stood up in your class and berated you and said a couple really nasty things, maybe sexually, about you. You could remember that to this day, couldn't you? But you know what, Michelle? You probably couldn't remember what you had for lunch or who you had lunch with. Come on, do you ever think about that? Why are there certain things you remember? It's right up here in your brain. God made you that way. There is a chemical. It's called norepinephrine. And it's a memory chemical. And this is what happens. When you're in a very emotional situation where your 5 senses are involved, norepinephrine is released in your brain. And it takes that emotion, it takes that experience, it takes that image, and it paper clips it or attaches it to your brain for recall. Now, in many ways, that's a defensive device. So that, say it was a real harmful situation. So next time you're around that guy that said that to you, you'll back off, you'll be careful, everything. Why? You remember. God gave you that memory for defense. Also gave you memory for a wonderful, wonderful experience of sex and love in marriage. And yet it can be very destructive. And it starts right in your brain. You say, what do you mean? It's called the law of strength. Wow. Maybe one of you better do. He's probably a little stronger than I am. But the law of strength, and this is what it means. That chemical takes that emotion, that experience, that vision, what you look at, and it's called paper clipping it to your mind. And when it's paper clipped to your mind, you don't forget. You can take all those experiences right into marriage with you. In Hebrews 13:4, the Word of God says this. You probably read it once in a while, probably not a whole lot because it's in Hebrews. You probably read the Gospel of John in the book of Hebrews. But it says, let the marriage be held in honor among all. And what does that mean? Every time when I was single, I said no to sexual pressure. I was holding my marriage in high esteem. I've been married 39 years, to the same woman. And in 39 years, every time I've said no to sex outside of marriage, to some affair, anything, do you see what I'm doing? I'm holding my marriage in high esteem. It says, let marriage be held in honor among all. Now get this. And let the marriage bed be pure or undefiled. Now what in the world does that mean? Well, the word marriage bed there, now I am quoting from the scripture, is literally the word for sexual coitus or intercourse. You say, what? You shouldn't say that word. It's in the Bible. We just water it down. Marriage bed, what it says is this, and let sexual intercourse be pure. Whoa. Now what does that mean? Remember we looked at purity as living according to original design. Now another implication of it is this. It's saying the same thing, but it won't sound like it. To be pure means no foreign element. In other words, if there's a foreign element in there, it's not the way it was originally created to be. And so purity can be no foreign element. Say you have 2 glasses of water. One glass has simply H2O and it's pure. But the other has a little garbage, a little gunk added to it. Becomes very colorful. It's impure. Why? A foreign element entered a pure substance. Now this is what the Word of God says. Don't let a foreign element enter sexual intercourse in your marriage bed. Now, how does that happen? It happens through the memory chemical. Say what? Yeah. If anything triggers it, it's sex. Because now even science will say, you cannot separate the physical aspect from sex from any other area of your life. You can't. When you become involved in sex, it involves everything that you are as a person. You cannot separate it. Physically, emotionally, spiritually, everything. And so it's embedded into memory. And this is what often happens. I had a pastor at the university. I was lecturing at the University of Washington, and I hadn't seen him for a long time. He said, could I take you to the airport in the morning? And I said, sure. We got in the car, and he was a little quiet, and I'd spoken that night on sex. And he said, Josh, I need your help. He said, I've been married for 17 years. I think it was 17 years. He said, I'm married to a beautiful woman, but I've never, ever been in bed alone with my wife. I went, whoa, that's quite a public confession. I knew what he was saying. I said, what do you mean? He said, this is what I meant. When I was in high school, I wasn't a believer, and I played around a lot sexually, a lot. And it carried right over into the university. In the university, I trusted Christ as Savior and Lord. But you know, if any one area in my life it didn't affect was my sex life. Said, then I met my wife my junior year. Josh, up until then, I never knew there was any woman as beautiful as she was. I never dreamed there was. And we came to love one another. Of all, this is key. Ladies, you listen to this. He said, this was the first woman. He had sex with many. First woman I wanted to be the mother of my children. That's a good indicator for a man. No, it really is. Not do I love her, but do I want her to be the mother of my children. And we got married. And he said, Josh, starting my wedding night, all the flashbacks. He called it this. He said, the reruns in the theater of my mind kept coming back from all those other girls. The ghost of relationships, and that's physical. It's released in your mind to do that. But in this situation, it can be very destructive. I just got a hold of this note from a young lady. It's an extract out of her letter. And this is what she says. She's 33 years old. The hardest breakup I ever had was with the first person I had sex with. Do you know why that's true? You ever heard people say, boy, when we broke up and walked away, I felt like I left part of myself there. You did. You did. Every relationship you have like that, you leave part of yourself there. And you leave that brief bonding that you've had and everything with that person. And she said, the hardest break I ever had was with the first person I had sex with. 15 years later, I still don't think I'm over him. I still dream about him, think about him, and this is a key, compare him with every guy since then to him. I'm married now, and I feel like it's a threesome in my heart. He is still here. It is like he's a part of me, and I still can't get over him. That's because of the memory chemical. Those memories, experiences, feelings, emotions paper-clipped to your brain. And folks, there is no condom for the mind. Most marriages are made or broken in the mind. Sexual relationships ultimately are made or broke, not between your legs, between your ears in your mind. Is there a good feeling hormone? Wouldn't it be neat to have that? You do. You realize that? It's called dopamine. You ever heard of it? Probably haven't. Dopamine is that chemical that is released that gives you a feel-good, exciting, rewarding feeling. It's kind of, I put it this way, dopamine is that chemical that says, I've got to have it. I've got to do more of that. I've got to have more of that. It releases a tremendous joy in your life, starting with your brain. And it's called the reward signal when you enter into certain things. But here's the key. It's triggered by dope. I don't know if that's why it's called dopamine or dope came from that. It could be. But dope, sex, fast driving, everything would trigger it, that feel-good feeling. But here's the thing. The dopamine, that good feeling, is value neutral. It can't tell the difference between good behavior or poor behavior, constructive behavior or destructive behavior. When it's released in your body, say like to a guy, it can't tell the difference between rape or consensual sex. It's value neutral. It can't tell the difference between fast, reckless driving or regular driving. And here's the problem. It starts, the dopamine, if that's all there is to it, and there's not the extension of the relationship where oxytocin and the other chemicals are released, you start to have more of it to get the same feeling. Well, you've heard people talk about drugs. All of a sudden they got to have more and more and more. Well, it's the same thing, whether it's sex, fast driving, or what. And it's part of your brain, a chemical that is released in your body. And so it starts to damage your ability to bond. It's like sexually, each time you have a relationship, you go to another woman, guys, you always have to have a little bit more because it starts to break down the bonding effect.
Dopamine is released when we do anything exciting, whether it's sex or whether it's playing baseball or making good grades in school. Whenever you do something exciting, it's released. It is the same hormone that is released when you're involved in drugs and risky behavior. It makes you want to repeat that activity, whatever it is, because it's exciting. Dopamine is values neutral, which means that it's released whenever you do anything exciting, good or bad, risky or not risky, consequences or not. Why do I feel so bad after I've had sexual relations, if it's okay for me as a teen? The answer to that question is simple. Sex changes the nature of the relationship and often causes emotions to run high. You get the dopamine exhilaration and feeling, and you can sometimes substitute that feeling for the relationship with the person. Anytime you separate sex from the emotions, then it becomes a raw animal act, and you're actually chasing the dopamine high rather than the relationship with the person. So remember, you can no longer go back once you've begun to have sex in a relationship.
Well, if you start using pornography and you start using images for that, and now you're looking at a picture of a girl in a magazine, or you're watching a DVD, and you begin to bond with that image, even if it's not a real person, even if it's not actually having sex with multiple partners. Pornography causes a bond with the image. And that use of pornography over time can damage your ability to bond to your spouse. And I think that was one of the big misnomers, is I think we thought, well, we'll use pornography and masturbate until we get married, and then once we get married, we can put all that away and it won't be necessary because we'll have the real thing and the spouse that we love. The problem is it didn't work that way, and the pornography and the masturbation continued to be a consistent problem within the marriage, and it ended up causing a lot of sexual dysfunction in marriage because it becomes addictive. This hormone, these neurochemicals in your brain become addictive, the way heroin or cocaine or any other drug would do. And so now I wish I could just be bonding with my wife or with my spouse, but now I require the pornography and the masturbation, even in a marriage, in order for me to experience the brain chemical response and the bonding that I'm looking for.
It's kind of like, would you hand that to me there? Is there a relationship between duct tape and sex? You say, come on. Yeah, there's a huge relationship. Let me show you what I mean. Roll up your sleeve there. Por favor. Just right here. Roll your sleeve up, not your stomach. Oh my gosh, are you hairy? Okay. Now, this is like the first sexual relationship. Let me do this. Oh! You can put that back now. Stick your arm up here. Come on, put it up here. Now, this is like your first sexual relationship. Now, wait a minute. Now, your second one. Now, your third one. And after a couple more, it won't even stick. And it all comes off on here. And you walk away with part of that person. This is what happens with promiscuous sex. And it gets to the point, because it starts in your brain, you got to have more and more and more. And that's what's called the joy hormone, or the good feeling hormone, is that.
When I used to speak in classrooms, I used to take duct tape with me, or packing tape, and I'd say sex has the ability to bond two people together, just like this tape. And I'd take a piece of that tape and I'd rip it off and I'd roll up my sleeve and I would just wrap that duct tape right around my arm, and it'd stick really good the first time I did that. And I'd say, well, I don't want the tape here anymore, and I'd rip it off, and pieces of my arm would come with the back of the tape. Move it on to the next person, stick it to their arm. It'll stick a little, never as good as the first time, but a little. Rip it off their arm. Now we got junk from their arm and my arm on the back of this tape. Move it on to the next person, rip it off theirs. Now there's junk from theirs and theirs. And pretty soon this tape is going to stick to nothing at all. It's got so much junk from everywhere it's been. Sex is like that tape. It was meant to be the glue that took a man and a woman and glued them, kind of bonded them for life. And we've just recently found out through research that there is an actual neurochemical in your brain, we call it the bonding hormone, that is produced in males and females that assist with this bonding. Now, it's different in females and males. In women, that bond, that glue, that neurochemical in your brain is called oxytocin. And women release oxytocin in their brain 4 different times on 4 different occasions. One is through touching or prolonged hugging. So any kind of physical contact that is intimate for a woman will release a certain amount of that oxytocin. A stronger release happens at orgasm from sex, and then also right at the onset of labor, the brain will produce oxytocin, and then also while she nurses a baby. So there is a purpose for that oxytocin release. It was meant to bond you in a very physiological way to either that partner or to your offspring. And that's how oxytocin works. And what we found is if we continually change partners, that the oxytocin in the brain doesn't function the way it's supposed to brain, and it affects the bonding.
Does our mind have a central control system? Is there a system that controls everything we see, feel, hear, think, decisions we make and all? Yeah, but it's probably not what you think. In the brain, the control center for most people is in the front. It's called the prefrontal cortex or lobe. The prefrontal lobe or cortex. Now, here's what happens when you're born. When you're born, you don't operate out of the prefrontal cortex. You operate out of the limbic system, which is in the back in the inner part of your brain. And it's basically raw emotion. It's raw emotion. That part of the brain, you can't make decisions based on future consequences or anything. Everything is based on the immediate and usually just raw emotion. As you grow older, it starts to switch from the limbic system around to the front to the prefrontal cortex. I call this the center of civilization because without this, you could not have morality. Without this, you couldn't have right from wrong. Not your limbic system, that's raw emotion. Without your prefrontal cortex. And here's what happens. When you're born, you operate out of the limbic system. As you grow older, it gradually switches around. But do you know what? It doesn't normally complete itself until the mid-20s. You with me? Science wouldn't have said this 20 years ago. Now they do. It's proven. You're usually about 23, 24, 27 before you start fully operating out of here. Even college students are basically operating out of the limbic system, maybe half and half. And it's like when you're operating out here, you're asleep at the wheel. That's kind of what it's like when it comes to moral choices. Or out of here, the limbic system was you leap before you ever look. You jump off a cliff before you know if it's 2 feet or 200 feet. When it comes around here, then you can make moral choices. And one of the biggest things is this. When it comes up here to the forefront, but not to your about 25, your mid-20s, can you basically make choices and decisions based on future consequences? Oh. You show me a university student that doesn't think he or she can't make moral choices based on future. Every one of them say yes, when in reality, no. You say, whoa, why do you think car rentals say you can't rent a car till you're 25? Simple statistics show it. No matter how many PhDs you have, how educated you are, intelligent or anything else, you're still operating out of the limbic system. And now they can watch it. I mean, they can literally watch it operate. As you get older, everything else. And you see on the graphic here how the brain progresses into the dark blue areas where you operate from the front. And this is where long-term consequences can be evaluated. This is why. I've said this for years, and I felt like a lone voice in the wilderness. Now, science is saying it. Parents need to play a major role in their life up all the way through the university until they're about 25 years of age. To most university students, that would be an insult, but that's because they haven't understood what's happening in their brain. Now, you have to understand, it doesn't matter how smart you are. Doesn't matter if you have 10 PhDs. It doesn't affect it. That's why you can have 20 PhDs, but you still can't rent a car until you're 25. Okay, well, we talk a lot about women. What about men? Do men have a sweetheart Valentine hormone? Yeah, even the worst of them, girls, ladies. Yeah, you know what it's called? It's called vasopressin. It's very similar to oxytocin. But vasopressin works more in the male. It's the male sweetheart hormone. It creates a partial bond. The ultimate bond is done by oxytocin, but it creates a partial bond like through sexual activity. But here's again, they have now shown that promiscuous sexual activity will damage the ability to form long-term relationships. And it's all right here in your brain. Wow. The way God made us, it's marvelous. And His Word coincides right along with everything that I've shared here. About oxytocin, dopamine, vasopressin, everything. What happens is with vasopressin, it'll start to wear down, and it desensitizes the risk of short-term relationships where you can't look at them realistically. And it's chemical in your mind. And this is why a man can go out and have sex with a prostitute and totally enjoy it. Totally enjoy it.
Now, males have a neurochemical called vasopressin, which has not been studied as much as oxytocin in females, but they've begun to study that, and that is called the male, they call it the monogamy hormone, and it is the hormone that helps a male bond with his mate so that he doesn't search for sex in other places, and that also happens at orgasm with males. And so the reality is that we tell, when we tell you that sex will bond you together, it's not just an emotional bond. There is actually a physiological component that's going on in your brain that was meant to be there to protect relationships, to protect spouses, and to protect families so that children would grow up with two parents who would raise them.
When I shared this with my son and my daughters, they were like 10, 11, 12 years old. Most of you haven't even heard what I'm going to be saying here now. Has modern medicine, now most of you think it has modern medicine pretty much eliminated STDs and infections? Almost just the opposite. When I was your age, wow, that was a long time ago. That was a few decades ago. When I was your age, there were only mainly two sexually transmitted diseases, syphilis and gonorrhea. Both were cured with a shot. Do you know how many major sexually transmitted diseases there are now? 25. Actually, you could put it about 100, but 25 major sexually transmitted diseases with all the modern medicine and everything. And when I was your age, there was two. 19 of these 25, there's no cure. Bet you didn't know that. You know why? They're viruses. They're viruses, and there is no cure. No shot, no nothing. There is no cure. Look at it this way. In the 1960s, 1 out of every 60 teens sexually involved got an STD. In the 1970s, 1 out of 47. In 2010, 1 out of 4. You see the difference with the culture you're living in and all over the world? China, Peru, France, Kazakhstan, Ghana, Nigeria, Jamaica, Texas, but all over the world, 25 major sexually transmitted diseases. Those of you that I'm sharing with from other countries, I don't know all the stats in your countries. It's almost impossible to get them. But those that I have been able to get and check out, there's very little difference between any culture in the world than from the American culture. Almost every culture is just a little bit ahead or a little bit behind. Now, in much of my conversation, I'll be using statistics about the United States. But in Argentina, trust me, not number-wise, percentage-wise, is the same thing in Argentina as here, or in China, or it could be a little worse in China than Argentina. And there, let me show you. Do you know there are 70 million Americans right now with a sexually transmitted disease? 40-some million incurable. No cure. 500 million people every year in the world, 500 million, get a sexually transmitted disease every year. Multiply that out. 500 million. Just in the United States, every 12 months, 19 million Americans get a sexually transmitted disease. That's not through 4 years of high school or college. That's every year of high school and college. That's 52,055 Americans every single day gets a sexually transmitted disease. You think you can play around and beat the odds? There's hardly anyone in the world that will play around sexually and beat the odds. The statistics show it. I documented in my book, Why True Love Waits. That's 2,169 Americans every single hour, 24/7, gets a sexually transmitted disease. In the United States with teenagers, 1 in 4 14 to 19-year-olds are infected with HPV, chlamydia, genital herpes, and trichomoniasis. 1 out of every 4 who has ever had sex. Right now, they're infected. Let me ask you a question. What percentage of sexually active women can expect to get an HPV infection? If you're a woman, now, whenever you use the term sexually active, that means just one time. That includes somebody who just had sex one time and they're 14, they're considered sexually active. That's key to understand. And the reason is these diseases stay in your life for years. So when I say sexually active teen, or a scientist does whatever, that can be a person that just had sex one time and they're 14 years old. What percentage of sexually active women can expect to get the number 1 sexually transmitted virus, HPV? What do you think? 20%? 60%? 80%? 120%? It's 80% of sexually active women will get, and there's no cure for it, HPV, will get infected by HPV. Don't tell me you'll beat the odds. The reason is, you go all the way through high school and college, think you beat the odds, and about 28, 30, you get some blood tests, something else, you gotta go home and tell your spouse, I'm infected. I'm infected.
How do I know if I'm ready to have sex? Sex is one of the most intimate relationships you will ever have with another person. Are you ready for that? Knowing that you will be a part of that person's life forever, whether it's imprinted physically or whether there's an imprint in your brain, you have to decide for yourself, but also for the other person. Are you ready to take the risk for STDs? Condoms, we've decided, are not safe enough. Are you ready for pregnancy or any of the other consequences of sex? The songs and the movies don't talk about consequences like that, but are you ready to change your future forever?
What is the most common STD? And you know what? The top 6, probably half of them, you don't even know anything about, or possibly all of them. Here are the top 6. Chlamydia. Just in the United States, this is just the United States, 2.8 million every year get chlamydia. Genital herpes, 1 million a year. It's called HSV, genital herpes. And there's no cure for it. No cure. 40-some million Americans have it, and there's no cure. Crabs. Ooh, doesn't that sound awful? Pelvic lice. I wanted to have a picture to put up, but it's so, it's so ugly. I couldn't even put it up in the video. It's so bad. But think of this. 3 million people a year get crabs or pelvic lice, just in the United States. Trichomoniasis. I don't know exactly how you pronounce that one. I call it trickle. 7 million a year. Of HIV, 46,000. HPV, human papillomavirus, 6 million a year. Now, the Centers for Disease Control, which is probably the #1 organization in the world in infectious disease, says that HPV, human papillomavirus, is the #1 sexually transmitted disease in the United States and the world. Even though trichomoniasis, there's 7 million, but it'll vacillate between 5 and 7 million. But the reason they say the 6 million with HPV is #1, because with trichomoniasis, it's quite easily to cure it. There is no cure for HPV. Most of you here probably doesn't even know what it means or anything. #1 sexually transmitted disease, HPV. At UCLA Medical School, they said there is no cure for it. There is no cure. In fact, you know what? There's no test you can take. You only see it by the symptoms. You can't go get a wedding marriage thing to see if you have it or not. And it stays concealed about 10 to 12 years in the human body. There's this real popular TV show, and I think it's all over the world, called Law and Order. Last night I was watching it, Law and Order, and there was an African-American lady who's the lieutenant, runs the office kind of hardcore, and she got real soft and everything else. It's been leading up for a few shows, and she finally went to the doctor, took tests, and they said, you have cancer, pelvic or cervix cancer. You're HPV infected. That's what caused it. And she says, well, I can't be. I've only known this man, this wonderful man, for 1 year, 1 month. And when he said, I'm sorry, then you could have had it for years. Well, I haven't been married for 5 years. And she stops, says, that blankety blank, he gave me HPV. And she just now found out on it. Boy, just in America, I want you overseas to understand every country, just in the United States, 20 million Americans have HPV. Now here's what you have to understand. HPV in the last 5 years has killed more women than HIV and AIDS. You don't even know anything about it, do you? Isn't that amazing? Killing more women than HIV and AIDS, and women don't even know anything about it. #1 sexually transmitted disease, and there is no cure. 20 million Americans have it. 6.2 million Americans every year is infected. Multiply that out. 50% of all sexually active who have ever had sex one time will be infected. Whew. And nobody's talking about it. Of U.S. women infected with HPV, just women right now, is 26.8% of the entire women's population. And nobody's talking about it. And it's killing more women than HIV and AIDS. And it's passed on 10 times faster. It's 10 times more efficient than AIDS and HIV. Everybody's talking about HIV. It's HPV that's killing people, and nobody talks about it. And it's passed on just like that, and you don't even know you have it for 10, 12, 14 years. 98 to 99%, no symptoms. Now, if you have a very strong health system in your body, it will often fight it off. A good percentage of it will, without you even knowing it, your body will take care of it. But it's that large percentage that will never leave your body that does the unbelievable damage. But this is what's amazing. In Canada, this would probably be true of any country in the world, 90% of Canadian teenagers, probably just like China, American, Germany, France, everywhere, said they're very knowledgeable about sex. Only 19% had even heard of HPV. Only 20% knew cancer was one of the consequences of HPV. Only 20%. And it's the same thing with teenagers all over the world. They think they're so smart, so loud, I know all this. In reality, young people, you don't know hardly anything when it comes to sexually transmitted diseases. Most of you have never even known how your brain works, operates, what bonds you to somebody else, what gives you that thrill, that excitement, how to control it, which we'll look at. It's just mind-boggling.
For about 9 years, I counseled in crisis pregnancy centers in Minneapolis, and for 9 years, I would have girls in my office every day saying, "Pam, I didn't know. If someone would have told me that this is what was going to happen to me, I would have made a different choice." And I started to realize that there were a lot of students out there who were making the really tough choices about sex, having absolutely no idea what the consequence of that choice would be. I mean, the media shows them, oh, well, you can just jump in, have sex with this person or that person. No one gets herpes. No one ends, well, you might see a teen pregnancy, but they kind of shove it to the side. And the reality is that when you make a decision to have sex outside of a monogamous relationship, outside of marriage, there will always be a cost. It was just sad that so many of these students didn't fully understand the price that they were paying.
Now, HPV virus, it's a virus, that's why there's no cure. But how many different HPV viruses, which you'd say different diseases, how many different HPV viruses are there? 40? 80? 100? 120? How many of you think there's 40 different viruses? 80 different viruses? 100 different HPV viruses? You must think there's 120? 100 different HPV viruses. 40 of them causes genital sexual infection. 40 of them. 18 are high risk for cancer. Under these 130 are sexually transmitted. Whew. You take the 25, add this, you could actually say there's 125 sexually transmitted diseases. That's staggering. Another question. What percentage of women will have HPV by the age of 50? 25%? 35%? 50%? 72%? 50% of all women by the time they're 50 will be HPV infected. And there's no cure. It's killing more women than HIV and AIDS. What percentage of sexually active men will get HPV? 50%? Whoa, that's starting off big. 70%, 80%, 90%. 70%. Imagine if someone you think a lot of is sexually involved. What are the chances of them having an STD? 20%? 30%? 40%? 50%? What do you think, Michelle?
40%.
Almost 50. Just look at your friends. You have 5 friends, 2.5 of them are infected. And all of them think they're so smart they'll beat the odds. It's always somebody else. I can play around and beat the odds. No. In my book, I pretty well prove you'll never play around and beat the odds outside of a loving commitment of marriage. The statistics are totally against you. But everyone thinks, I can go to Las Vegas and walk away with more money, when 94% walk away with less money than they ever came. And there. How many will get an STD today? 52,000, just Americans. Yesterday, 52,000. Tomorrow, 52,000. Day after tomorrow, 52,000. That's 208,000 in 4 days. You won't beat the odds.
Usually, I would have girls come into my crisis pregnancy center for a pregnancy test, and they're scared to death, and their biggest fear is that they might be pregnant. So one of the biggest myths that students believe is that the only thing that could happen if they have sex outside of marriage is they could get pregnant. And I would come in and I would do a negative pregnancy test and look at this young girl and say, hey, your test is negative. And she'd be like, well, thank goodness, this big look of relief. She's ready to leave my clinic. And I'm like, wait a minute. Have you been tested for syphilis, gonorrhea, herpes, chlamydia, trichomonas, vulvodynia, arthritis, hepatitis B, hepatitis C, HPV, HIV? Have you been tested for these things? And she's like, me? Well, I didn't think I would need to be tested for that. And the reality is you're in here for a pregnancy test. If you're having sex, which is what you're telling me, you are at risk for all of these other diseases. It's not just pregnancy. And I think the other big myth that they have, which I find fascinating, is even the college girls would come in and we'd go through the same thing, and I say, well, your test is negative, but now you need an OBGYN, you need to have a pap smear, you need blood tests, you need to be tested for STD. And these girls would be like, well, I was drunk. I'm like, did you think herpes asks now? Excuse me, are you sober or drunk? Because we only infect sober people. I mean, just because you're drunk does not mean that the consequence of the decision or lack of the decision, but the consequence of having sex is going to be any less or not there. And so I think there's just this kind of, the biggest myth for kids is just that they think I can do these things, either I'm copying the behavior I'm seeing from the media or I'm doing what everybody else seems to be doing, and this disease won't happen to me, or this consequence won't happen to me. And part of the problem is it's not tattooed to their forehead. I mean, 1 in 4 students in the United States is infected with an STD. The problem is you can't see it. So if you can't see it, it doesn't exist. As long as when they get up the next morning, if they don't feel like they have a symptom, then they're not infected. And the reality is very different. And a lot of these students are infected and they don't even know it.
Who has the highest HPV rate, human papillomavirus rate? 15 to 20-year-olds, 20 to 24-year-olds, or 25 to 27-year-olds? What do you think?
25, 27?
Close, 20 to 24-year-olds. 26.8% are infected. I'll tell you what, between 20 and 24, you don't have much of a chance. You really don't. Statistics show it. In a minute, you'll find out why.
Right now, in the United States, sexually transmitted disease is a huge epidemic. We have probably, you have 14,000 teenagers infected every day. When we include the college population through about age 22, we have 38,000 newly infected students every day. If you would have graduated from high school in 1967, 1 in 32 of your classmates would have been infected with an STD. I mean, you would have had to have had a few partners before you came in contact with it. If you would have graduated with me in 1982, 1 in 18 of my classmates was infected. Today, it's 1 in 4. 1/4 of our kids is infected. So it does not take that, you have 2 partners and you've been exposed to STD. That's all it takes. And so that's really the problem.
How many people are infected with genital herpes? There's no cure. It's called HSV, HPV, human papillomas, HSV, genital herpes. 45 million, 55 million, or 62 million Americans? What do you think?
Second option, 52.
45 million.
45.
Yeah. Not as bad as you thought. You're from Brazil, aren't you?
Yeah.
I love your accent. It's great. How many people are infected when the Bible says, avoid sexual immorality, for it's the one sin you commit against your body? You know why I like statistics? It lets me see people. I don't look at statistics. When I see these statistics, I see young people. People I meet all the time.
What's the big deal about STDs? Aren't they curable? STDs are a big deal. If you get one, it's a viral infection, you may have it for life. If you get one and it's a bacterial infection, we may treat the bacteria and cure it, but the effects may still be in your body, such as gonorrhea and chlamydia can cause pelvic inflammatory disease, which may make it impossible for you to get pregnant in the future. Viral infections sometimes can be released by your body, but if they're not, then you have those infections for life.
How many people are infected with genital herpes over 11 years old? 1 in 5. Most of you are university students here. How prevalent is HPV among university women? You ready? Major study done, documented in my book. All women in universities right now, most of you are in universities, all women in universities right now who have ever had sex, maybe just one time, so you're 14, 15 years old, 63% are infected right now. And there's no cure. And it's killing more women than HIV and AIDS, and nobody talks about it. At Rutgers, 60% of sexually active women means a woman has just had sex one time, maybe not in university, back when she was 14 years old. 60% are infected with HSV, genital herpes. That's true of almost every university. I was at one university where they have registered in the health department, says 7,800 students infected with HPV. One university. Do more women get STDs than men? Twice as likely. Twice as likely. One report showed that 21% of women were infected with genital herpes compared to 11.5% of men. 21% of women, 11% of men. Why is that? Here's why. Please listen. You young ladies, listen to it. You got your whole life ahead of you. Most of these STDs, which are viruses, they incubate, multiply, and grow in an environment that is non-oxygen, warm, and moist. That's not a man's penis. That's a woman's vagina. When a man pulls out, the oxygen will destroy much of it. It stays within the woman in a non-oxygen, warm, moist area, which is like a factory. That's why women are so much more prevalent with STDs than men. Oh, well, we'll beat the odds. Isn't that what they say? We'll beat the odds.
You know, I think one of the big things that teenagers, another thing that they don't fully understand is this, that out of the 30, we have over 30 major STDs. And out of the 30 major sexually transmitted diseases that we have, 26 of them primarily damage women. Girls will always pay the higher price. And it's you know, girls are like, well, that's not fair. You know, I make the same choice and I'm the one who has to pay. And it's typically within their fertility. Chlamydia causes infertility in women through scarred fallopian tubes, through scarred the uterine lining. We have obviously cervical cancer, does not happen to men, they don't have a cervix. So that cancer as a result of HPV is primarily affecting women, not only death, but also their ability to have children. So at the end of the day, women are gonna, especially with fertility, gonna pay this huge price. They're gonna find out that he went on, you know, graduated from high school, met another girl, married her, and had a family. She is sterile, can now never have children. And girls are like, well, that's not fair. Well, in case you missed this in 6th grade human reproduction and anatomy, we're different. Boys' and girls' bodies are not the same. Girls, we have an open sexual system. The men, the boys, have closed sexual systems. We're easier to infect and we're easier to damage. It's the way we're made.
Is it true that young people get more STDs than any other group? Young people, like almost every culture, is up to 25 years of age. And we're going to look at that in the United States. Young people is up to 20, I would go like from 12 years old to 25 would be categorized as young. Of youth in the United States, but it's true in almost every culture, in Brazil, in Haiti, and in Argentina. Gee, we had all South America here. Where are you from?
United States.
Oh, you're right here at home, homegrown, good. But of 12 to 25-year-olds, 17% of the population, 48% of STDs. I bet you didn't know that. Up to 25 years of age. Out of 19 million STDs every year that's contacted just in the United States, which same thing happens percentage-wise in China. Boy, that'd be a huge amount in China. China, everywhere. Same percentage-wise, Brazil, whatever. Of teens, 13 to 19-year-olds, 3 million a year. Of 15 to 24-year-olds, 9.1 million. That's 50% of all STDs and only 17% of the population. 24,900 15 to 24-year-olds every day gets an STD. That's 1,039 an hour. I didn't break it down to the second, but a few just happened. Within 2 years of having sex for the first time, how many teenagers will get infected? Let me repeat that. Within 2 years of having sex for the first time, how many teens will get infected? 10%, 30%, 50%, 70%. 50%. In 2 years after first sexual experience. What percentage of sexually active teens will get an STD every year? 25%. Every year. That's not 4 years of high school. Every year of high school. How many sexually active teenagers are infected right now? Get 100 teenagers together who have ever had sex. How many are infected? 15%? 23%? 28%? Or 40%? What do you think? 40%. I'm a dad. I got 4 grandkids. I'm a grandfather. I so wanted to raise my children where they didn't have to face any of these consequences. And thank God, none of them have. None of them have, my 3 daughters and my son. Now, why are teens more susceptible to STDs? Why? I want to share with you, and I'm going to try to do it in a very frank and straightforward way, what a lot of people wouldn't share. And I'll probably get criticized for it. But I sure shared it with my daughters and my son. It's the way you were created. Your sexual areas. For young ladies. The cervical lining. In the cervical lining within a woman's private sexual areas, a young girl has a high amount of what's called columnar cells exposed throughout the entire cervix lining. As you grow older, these cells are layered over with squamous epithelium cells. Squamous epithelium cells. That they start to form layers. It's not completely done until you're 23, 27 years age. Now get that. Remember with the mind, same thing here. To your mid-20s, before the squamous epithelium cells totally encase and thicken in the cervix. Now, so what's the difference? The columnar cells are extremely receptive, over 80% more receptive to infections than squamous epithelium cells in an older person, 25 years old. And these cells, say when sexual intercourse takes place and a virus is planted in there, which happens a lot of times, these cells almost act like suction cups. And in factories that multiply. When you get about your mid-20s, it starts to harden. The cervix does. And it rejects the viruses then. Let me show you an illustration of this. Just what I want. Some sand. Yeah, look at that, man. A friend of mine collected it for me. Let's say this is the squamous epithelium at about 25 years in age and up. The dirt is a virus. See that? Now, take this is the columnar cells that a teenager has. And not completely changed until about 25 with a virus. Ooh. That's what it does. That's why young people, especially young women, are way out of proportion on sexually transmitted disease. Of course, you can't tell them anything. They know everything. Like the Canadian teenagers, the Chinese teenagers, the Brazilian the Haitian teenagers, the Argentine. Are you from Texas? Texan teenagers. But folks, that's the difference. That is why there's such a prevalence of sexually transmitted disease among young people. A teenager is 80% more likely to get an STD than somebody after 25 years of age. Whew. Now here's the key. Your mouth and your anus. Bet you never heard that on video. But your mouth and anus never changes from columnar cells. You hear me? And we'll see the tremendous devastation of that with oral sex, anal sex, whatever. It's devastating because they're always columnar. They're always like this. Won't condoms reduce the chances of getting an STD? Yes and no. Mainly no. It works fairly good on HIV. You could go from 40 to maybe 70% effectiveness. But folks, it's that 30% who wants to take a chance with it. I mean, people do, but who wants to take a chance with that? But for the most part, condoms do not reduce STDs and infection. Why? Most STDs, 19 of the 20, are viruses. They're viruses. And they're passed by areas of the body not even covered by a condom. Like HPV, which is a virus, is passed by moisture around your private sexual areas. Not even covered by a condom. You want to wear a condom and have safe sex, a condom would have to look like a frogman's wetsuit. I'm serious. You know, it's like, a girl says, let's have sex. The guy says, have put my condom on. Okay. I'm serious. You know that they look like pantyhose because it's passed by areas not even covered by. We'll say, well, what if you wear 2 or 3 condoms? Wear 100. It still doesn't cover it. It makes no difference. For 19 of these 25. At a major university, they did a study of all the men and women on campus infected with HPV. Of those who had HPV and had sex without wearing a condom, in just 3 acts of sex, 44% of their partners got infected. If it had been AIDS, it had been 4%. See, HPV is 10 times more efficient. Now, hear what I'm saying. Students had HPV and didn't wear a condom. 44% of their partners were infected in 3 acts of sex. Those who wore condoms, 42% were infected. 2% efficiency. Why? It doesn't cover the area where it's affected. Look, a woman on average, of course, most women in the world are above average, but a woman on average could get pregnant, say, 8 days a month. 8 days a month. Multiply that out by 12, should be 96, isn't it? 96. So 96 days a year you can get pregnant. Now, when it comes to condoms, they did a study with pregnancy. They caught those that kept the condom failure rates for years in the United States, probably the same true in every country. They found them cheating. You know what they did? U.S. government caught them. Those where 100% condoms were used and a woman got pregnant and had an abortion, they only counted half of them in the condom failure rate. Why? So it'll keep the condom failure rate down. Because when somebody at the university has, Safe Sex Week or whatever and gives you a box of condoms, it's like giving somebody a package of cigarettes saying, I love you. They got to get people using condoms. That's how they ultimately make their money with blood tests and diseases, everything. And they found them cheating. So you know what the U.S. government did? I documented in my book, Why True Love Waits. Made them go all the way back to 1988 and recalculate the condom failure rate. Where normally most people say, they'll teach 4%, 6%. Well, when they recalculated, it came out to an average woman, 20 to 24 years of age, condoms used 100% of the time. In the first 12 months, 31% failure rate. 31 out of 100 women will call themselves mommy in 1 month, 20 to 24-year-olds. Now, 31% failure rate, but you can only get pregnant 96 days a year. And with 96 days, there's a 31% failure rate. Think what it'd be if you could get pregnant 365 days a year. It'd be 90% failure rate. But here is the point I'm driving home. You can only get pregnant 8 days a month, 96 days a year. Only the woman can get pregnant. With an STD, you can get an STD 365 days a year, and both the man and the woman can get it. So if a condom has a failure rate with pregnancy of 31% in 96 days, what is it for STDs in 365 days? Think with your mind, not with your pelvis. 20 of 25, according to the state of Minnesota here in the United States, it's true of any study, but the state of Minnesota published that 20 of 25 of the major sexually transmitted diseases are not affected or stopped by condoms, including HPV. Killing more women, HIV and AIDS, passed 10 times faster, and has no effectiveness. I bet you don't know this. For those of you from, whether you're in Saudi Arabia or Yemen or wherever, Egypt, one of my favorite countries in the whole world. In the United States, there's a government agency called Food and Drug Administration. They have to approve all medical devices, everything. I bet you didn't know. The FDA, Food and Drug Administration, will not certify condoms. I bet you never knew that, did you? Never knew that. Nobody talks about it. Everybody thinks it'll be. Why? They don't work. The failure rate for STDs is way off the chart. And the U.S. government won't even certify them. Oh, look. This is a box, what they are, condoms called Trojans. You ever read? You probably haven't. This is so ironic. And yet people will beat the odds. Right here, this is what it says on this box of condoms. America's #1 condom trusted for over 80 years. If used properly. Now, probably no one at the emotion of the moment of sex has ever used it properly. If used properly, latex condoms will help to reduce, not eliminate, no, the risk of transmission of HIV infection, AIDS, and many other sexually transmitted diseases. Never mentions, it can only mean 6 others. There's 25 major diseases, and 20 of them are not stopped by condoms, so it can only be 5. All the other major diseases can only be 5. It doesn't even mention HPV. It says, also highly effective against pregnancy. 31% failure rate for the average 20-24. Wow. Think with your mind, not with your pelvis. God gave you a wonderful mind to evaluate, to know, to understand. For example, you have batches, boxes of condoms come in. Do you know how many batches of condoms, what percentage are rejected by the U.S. government for what has happened to them in damage? 10%? 20% of all? 30, 40? 20%. Think of the ones that get through. Think of the ones that get through. And then those that they let through, they won't even certify. You want to see how many ways you've been lied to? And as a father, it just ticked me off. And I wasn't going to let my daughters and my son be fooled by it. I want to show you something. I got to use you. Por favor, ayúdame. Okay? Please help me. Stand up and scoot your chair back. This would be true even in Argentina. I want to show you what a medical person must wear when dealing with an infectious disease, whether a doctor, surgeon, whatever, like HPV, human papillomavirus, a contagious disease. You have to first, you must put on a special gown. Will you put that on, put it around you? It goes in the front like that. You'll look good in that. Either way, just put your hands through there. Then, you must have a head covering. This is a little more like a hairnet. Must have a head covering. You must have boot coverings, but it'd take too long to put them on your shoes. Then, you got to have condoms for the hands. Put those on. Probably roll them up a little bit there and say they're a little hard, aren't they? Just put it on halfway. Then, you've got to have a face mask. Yeah. Around there. Then you must wear eye coverings, a goggle. Now, that's what they wear to protect from HPV. Do you know what they want you to wear? A little condom. I'm serious. I mean, look, come on. And always you're guaranteed with a condom to have fluid exchange. You're not always guaranteed as a doctor. They want you. You look good. We got to get a picture of that. They want you to protect yourself with this little tiny piece of rubber or big piece of rubber, whatever, according. They want you to protect yourself with that. Think with your mind, not with your pelvis. Thank you. You can take that off. Come off a lot easier, don't they? Yeah. You see, young people, just think it through. This is what, as a daddy, I owed to my daughters to think all of this through, to help them walk through it. Because you see, up into your mid-20s, it's hard for the average person to project consequences out in the future. That's why God created moms and dads to help guide young people, even up through the university, for their own health. And yet my heart goes out to so many. When I think of so many in Haiti who have lost their parents, everyone, through the earthquake, my heart goes out. When I think of, there'll soon be up to 25 million AIDS orphans in Africa. What? Creating an angry continent. And the last thing the world ever wants is an angry 20-year-old. Well, if neither of us have any symptoms, can we still have an HD infection? You better believe it. Look, HPV, human papillomas, stays totally hidden for 10 to 12 years usually on an average. Chlamydia, 85% of the women, 40% of the men have no symptoms, but they pass it on. HSV2, genital herpes, 90% no symptoms. AIDS, 10 to 15 years. It can incubate, pass on everything without symptoms.
Is it possible to have an STD and not have any visible symptoms? If so, How will I know if my partner is infected? Actually, 75% of chlamydia infections have no symptoms at all. 90% of herpes and HPV have no symptoms. And even 1 in 4 persons with HIV have no symptoms. The person with the infection may not know they have symptoms or infection at all. It's important, if you've had sex, to go get tested. Or if you're thinking about having sex, go with your potential partner and be tested. Go back for results. And if they do not want to do that, then you have a decision to make. Run.
So many people have what I call the credit card approach. Play now, pay later. Folks, you will pay. Avoid sexual immorality, for it's the one sin you commit against your body. That is an act of love by God. That's God saying, I love you so much, I want to protect you and provide for you. To have the most unbelievable experience in sex. Why jeopardize in a few years of single time for the years that can be so wonderful with your spouse? And so many jeopardize all that when they're young. And there is some of them can't project. That's why we need parents. That's why we need loving, significant adults in our lives. But the other thing is, are you smart enough to listen to them?
I think myths about sex and the consequences and for students not really fully understanding the price tag that they're going to pay if they get involved sexually come primarily from the media, it just because they are so bombarded with sex on such a regular basis. I mean, students are watching, you know, everything from the MTV Shot at Love show to The Bachelor to, I mean, they're watching kids jump in and out of bed with each other and having sex, and no one ever gets a disease. And that's why I used to tease that if herpes or HIV or human papillomavirus or chlamydia were tattooed to your forehead, if the minute you were infected there was something on your face, we would not have an STD problem, because all the kids would show up at school and they would go, oh my goodness, they have that disease. In fact, most STDs don't have any physical symptoms. And so teenagers believe that if I don't have a symptom, I'm not infected. And I tease them because the students will come to me after I speak in their school and they'll go, well, you need to come and speak to my school because we had 8 girls pregnant. But I don't know anyone at my school who's got a disease. Like, really? First of all, your friends aren't getting tested. And even if they were, they wouldn't tell you. I mean, do you really think they're going to show up at the lunchroom and go, hey, talked to the doctor yesterday, I went to the doctor, found out I have herpes, tell everybody by lunch? You know, I tease kids and tell them, maybe we can do this on the announcements from now on at your school every Monday morning. The following students contracted an STD over the weekend, they are. You know, I mean, that's not going to happen. And so pregnancy is the biggest fear because it's the most visible.
Can't I get a shot or take an antibiotic if you get an STD? 19 of the 25 STDs, there's no cure. I've said that over and over again. So no, you can't take an antibiotic or get a shot. You know, come on, these little things don't work with STDs. Injections don't work. No, there are for some of them treatments, but many of them are long, painful treatments. For one moment of an orgasm, incredible what people do. Say, well, there's a vaccination for HPV. Yes, there is. There's none for men. But yes, there is for women. But it must pretty much be taken when you're young. And if you already have HPV, it will do you no good. And there's no test you can take to find out really if you have it. So you never really have the peace of mind when you take it. And it's about 30% ineffective. 70% effective. But I sure wouldn't want to take a chance, think I got a peace of mind because I've had the vaccination for that 30%. There's no evidence whatsoever that the vaccine, one, will reduce the risk of cervical cancer caused by other HPVs. It only deals with several of the HPV viruses. Not all of them. Not all the ones that cause cancer. Only several of them. Most people don't realize that. But the two major ones it does deal with. But there's no evidence that it will reduce the risk for cervical cancer of the other HPV viruses. There's no evidence to reduce the risk of sexually transmitted infections or diseases. It won't. Not a vaccine for HPV. And here's the key. The duration of immunity following immunization is unknown. It'll take years before they find out. Years! Was it 1 year? Or is it 10 years? Is it 5 months or is it 10? It'll take years before they can even determine how long the immunity will last for that 70%. Very interesting, a mother came to me. It was in Poland. And I was presenting a lot of this material to educators in the universities and high schools for their sex education program. And this one teacher came up to me and she said, they sent around a thing to sign for the HPV vaccination. And she said, I'm a nurse, I went to the head nurse and said, will it do this? No, this, you know how long it lasts? No. Do you know what percentage? No. They said, I can't sign this then. She went home and told her daughter. Do you know what her daughter said to her? Now this, I met her daughter. Whoa, what a woman. This young lady said, Mom, thank you for not signing it. Her mother said, why? Because, Mom, if you would have signed it, it would have said you didn't trust me. I never thought of that. Interesting. It would have shown you didn't trust me. Boy, do you know 100,000 women just in the United States? Oh, I wish I knew the stats for every country of the world. 100,000 women between 15 and 25 because of an STD every year will never be able to have children. Oh, well, I'll beat the odds.